Jewish community and chairman of the International Commission for the Evaluation of the Crimes of the Nazi and Soviet occupation regimes in Lithuania. Paul Rusesa-Bijinga, 2005, born in June 1954, Mr. Rusesa-Bijinga is a Rwandan humanitarian who, while working as a hotel manager, hid and protected 1,268 Hutu and Tutsi refugees during the Rwandan genocide. Alfredo Jar, 2013, a Chilean-born artist, architect, and filmmaker who lives and works in New York. Jar talks about the power of art to reveal social injustice and inspire public action. He has the specific mission of engaging communities in dialogue. This past summer, I had the opportunity to attend the Dartmouth College Elite Basketball Camp, during which time my dad and I had the privilege of having breakfast with our speaker tonight, Professor Susannah Heschel. Her family also lost relatives in the Holocaust, and also, like what I learned about with my grandmother, her father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, turned despair into hope, in part by becoming active in the American Civil Rights Movement. Professor Heschel is an American author and professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College. She has served in numerous academic positions in various universities across the country and the world. She also has written a number of books, monographs, and articles. Just Google her and the list of her academic and literary achievements goes on and on. Professor Heschel is married to James Louis Aronson, Professor Emeritus of Earth Sciences at Dartmouth College, and the mother of two daughters, Gittel Esther Deborah Heschel Aronson and Abigail Natanya Mira Heschel Aronson. Professor Heschel will speak about the March on Selma and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. What happened? Why is it important to remember these events after 50 years? And perhaps what she thinks the next 50 years will be like for the students of today. Please help me welcome Professor Susannah Heschel.
That was such a lovely introduction. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the family nature of our gathering here this evening. Thank you. I thank you. Jonathan, where are you? There you are. And your brother Stephen, and of course Noah. And I thank this wonderful Westbury Christian School for its hospitality and such a warm welcome. It's good to be with all of you here today, this evening. I want to talk about, of course, about my father and his relationship with Dr. King and what it meant in that relationship, what we have to learn from that relationship also. But I also want to say something about the way we as academics talk about racism today. Can everybody hear me? Is that all right? You know, before I begin talking about my father and what happened in the 60s, let's just consider, first of all, what's going on this week. And I must tell you that when I heard, and I've been glued to the news, of course, when I heard about the massacres in Paris, and just a couple of days before that, there was a terrible bombing in Beirut, and shortly before, a Russian plane that was down in Sinai. And then you heard that 7 hours of shooting in Paris this last night. I'm sure you're following the news also. And it makes me wonder, when I hear things like that, perhaps we should pause. What are we doing? Giving lectures, attending lectures, as if nothing happened? Should we even continue with our lives? And yet, when I hear about these things, these terrible, terrible tragedies, the death, the devastation, I also realize that we, in fact, do need precisely this. We need critical thinking. We need careful scholarship. We need respect for the life of the mind. We need to think, pause, and we also very deeply need some spiritual renewal. So perhaps this is the appropriate moment to talk about this issue, to talk about this history. And yet, before we look back at the 60s, let's also remember that we take pride in the accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement, especially that march in Selma, which is commemorated every year, as you know, with groups of people. Representative John Lewis takes a group from Washington, from Congress, each year to Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. It was an important march that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And yet, as we well know, those voting rights are being undermined year by year by individual states, to the point where I wonder if we really do have the right as Americans at this point to celebrate what happened in Selma in 1965, or if we shouldn't hang our heads in shame over what we've done to that march and its accomplishments. What's going on in this country? Why has the penal population grown from 300,000 to 2 million in the past 30 years? We all are well aware, and I'm sure you've read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and if you haven't, I urge you to read it, along with Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, which I hope tonight will win the National Book Award that's taking place this evening in New York. But Michelle Alexander has given us what I think we should know already from our newspapers, from basic information, how drug laws have been fashioned with harsher penalties for possession of cheap crack cocaine. In some cities, Michelle Alexander writes, 80% of African American men have been given some sort of criminal record, leaving them subjected to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives, including in 11 states, a lifelong prohibition of felons of the right to vote. There are racial politics of incarceration, and they're concealed under the guise of law and order, or war on drugs, or zero tolerance, or 3 strikes and you're out, namely mandatory sentences of imprisonment. More people are in prison, more African Americans are in prison today than were slaves in the 19th century in this country. We conceal, we hide the racial politics at work. What do we mean by racism? There is an unacknowledged premise of racists, which is, of course, their own vulnerability. They are afraid of a danger that's posed to them that they're unable to defend against. We learn from studies of race that racism is something that fluctuates, that it conceals, that it's slippery, and that it's tenacious. Why do people remain racist? For what reason? What good does it do? Race is not static and immutable. It's fluid and contagious in the minds of the racist imagination. The fear is not of skin color per se. The fear is what? White people might become black. Judith Butler, the philosopher at Berkeley, speaks of frames that regulate not only our discourse, but also our emotions and our ethical commitments according to certain power relations. We often abide by a sociology of ignorance. We don't want to know. We're told, for example, that we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter, we should say all lives matter. Why? To conceal what's really going on, that it's Black lives that are being attacked. Used to be similar when people used to say there's no need for a feminist movement to protect women's rights. It's human rights that matters. A brilliant strategy for supporting the status quo and its injustices. What do we not know? That's the issue when we talk about racism. The theorist Sarah Ahmed says, it has become commonplace for whiteness to be represented as invisible, as the unseen, the unmarked, as if it's not a color. It is the absent presence, or the hidden referent, against which all other colors are measured as forms of deviance. But whiteness, she points out, is invisible only to those who inhabit it. What is fear these days? Don't we realize that our whiteness is what is frightening? An African American has far more reason to be frightened by a white person, especially one wearing a suit of government representation, such as a police uniform. And yet, who has the racism? In 1984, Jesse Jackson spoke at the Democratic National Convention. It was a speech that was viewed around the world. And he said, "We are bound by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, crying out from their graves for us to reach common ground." It was a wonderful speech, and my father was a good friend of Jesse Jackson. They worked together on Operation Breadbasket, an anti-poverty movement in Chicago. But he's pointing to something else, that my father's friendship with Martin Luther King has become a source of profound inspiration. It's not just a spot on the political map. This picture was actually neglected in those days. It was only some years after my father died in 1972, some years later, maybe 6 or 7 years later, that I began to hear people referring to my father going to Selma with pride. Jews started to talk about it. Until then, it was not a topic. All of a sudden. And then it became iconic. But I'll tell you what I think. My father went to Selma by himself. He went to civil rights marches and had to reschedule his classes, and the students would complain. He went by himself. He was a lonely figure. People weren't proud of this in those days. Now, this photograph has become iconic. It's reprinted in books about Black-Jewish relations, about Jewish history in America. Their relationship is invoked whenever there is call for hope, for inspiration, for transcendence of political conflict. My own feeling is that while, yes, it is a source of hope, it should also be a photograph of challenge, not of complacency, not simply patting ourselves on the back. Oh, Abraham Heschel went to Selma. But what are we doing now? And I know that that's what my father would want as well. This may be a painting familiar to some of you. It's a famous painting from the mid-19th century by Moritz Oppenheim, a German Jewish painter, and it depicts the friendship in the late 18th century in Berlin in the German Enlightenment between the Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn and the German Christian writer Gotthold Lessing. Their friendship was known throughout Europe. It was extraordinary that a Jew and a Christian, two philosophers, would sit together, and as you can see, they played chess. And by the way, you see there's even a woman in the picture, yeah, bringing in a cup of tea for the men. Is that nice? Women have a place, see? Their friendship, in many ways, marks the beginning of modern Jewish history, that a Jew and a Christian could come together to have intellectual discussion, to play chess, to talk about issues of the day. It meant so much. It was extraordinary in that day. And so too, my father's friendship with Dr. King. In a way, these two pictures are bookends of modern Jewish history. How important it is, especially for Jews, to know about this friendship, this relationship, that it happened in the 60s, not that long after European Jews were eradicated. There's an identification that's represented by this picture, by this friendship, an identification that African Americans and Jews also together have quests for identity. They have a quest, we have a quest for spiritual inspiration. We look for guidance to get out of the horrors of racism, the Holocaust. We face also the migrations, the transformations that the world underwent after World War II. I want to talk briefly about some of my father's work together with Dr. King in civil rights, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, anti-poverty efforts, also in the movement to free Soviet Jews. But I want us to think together tonight about what drew them together, what inspired them. How did it happen that two people from such very different backgrounds, and my father from a Hasidic world in Poland, and Dr. King from the United States, how did they come together, a Jew and a Christian, in this way? What was it? The Bible, the prophets, their faith, the way they thought about theology, their spiritual passion, their trust in God. There's one image that I don't have a picture, but I'll give it to you to imagine in your mind. If you ever have a chance to go to Selma, has anyone here been to Selma? Good. Well, the next time you go, visit the home of the Jacksons. Dr. Jackson was a dentist, an African-American dentist in Selma, and he and his wife had a little girl, and their home became the place where Dr. King stayed during the Selma movement for several months. And that home has been preserved. Everything is there. The bed where Dr. King slept, the telephone when he spoke to President Johnson on that phone in that home. Try to go there. Mrs. Jackson told me that the morning of the march, she came into the living room, and there were a whole bunch of people who had slept there overnight. My father was there, and Dr. King, and a priest was there, lots of people. And she came in the morning early, and she saw each one standing in a different corner of the living room praying. My father praying, Dr. King praying, each one alone saying their prayers, but together in that room. And to me, that's such an amazing moment just to think about it. That to me is what Selma represents. Extraordinary. My father first met Dr. King in 1963 in Chicago. There was a conference organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and it was on the topic religion and race. Two words that my father said should never be uttered in the same breath because they're diametrically opposed. That's where he met Dr. King for the first time, and my father opened his talk by saying, at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it is far from having been completed. What does it mean religion and race should be uttered the same breath? God is either the creator of all human beings or the creator of no one. To act in the spirit of race is to dismember the flesh of living humanity, my father said. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. Having brought the audience of that lecture in this conference within the precincts of Pharaoh's court, my father then takes the title of his lecture, Religion and Race, and transforms it. Either religion or race, one or the other. The Exodus, he says, has not yet been concluded. He means that history takes place in two realms, the profane and also the sacred. And that sacred history of the Exodus is our ongoing challenge. Now what's interesting to me, and this is pointed out actually by James Cone, James C-O-N-E, James Cone is a professor at Union Theological Seminary, published a book recently called The Lynching Tree. And in that book, Professor Cone compares my father to Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian. He says both of them talked about race, but Reinhold Niebuhr, James Cone says, was rather dry in his language, and my father was full of passion. Niebuhr began to change his tone after he met James Baldwin and engaged him in discussion. And then Niebuhr became more passionate. And I have to say, when I read that, I thought it was so interesting because my father actually never met James Baldwin. He taught at a Jewish seminary. He had no African-American colleagues or friends. I don't think he ever met a colleague who was African-American at any of the local universities in New York City. And yet the passion came from within. The passion came from within. From where? Yes, one could say, from my father's own experience, having lived in Nazi Germany and having seen his own professors at the university declare that the Old Testament is a Jewish book and has no place in the Christian Bible, and they threw it out. Or saying that Jesus wasn't a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan, and Hitler was doing what Jesus wanted. Can you imagine? He lived around people like that. And I could understand why my father would turn away and say, I'll have nothing more to do with Christian theologians. But he didn't. Nor did he say, like so many others, and this is the key turning point, like so many other Jews who said, after the Holocaust, never again to the Jewish people. My father said, after the Holocaust, never again to any human being. That was the difference. My father's passion came from the Bible. It came from the prophets, and he wrote a book about the prophets. It was his PhD dissertation in Berlin in 1932. He finished it just a couple of weeks before Hitler came to power. And then he expanded it and translated it into English and published it as a book in 1962. Andrew Young told me that everybody in the movement had a copy of the paperback in their hip pocket, and they took it with them and read it when they were in jail. Now, after meeting Dr. King in 1963 and giving that speech, my father and Dr. King gave lectures together, sometimes to Jewish groups. They talked about race, they talked about Israel, they talked about Soviet Jews, they talked about the war in Vietnam. And then came something else. Here are some pictures of Dr. King speaking at a group with my father at the Concord Hotel. It's a Jewish kosher hotel in the Catskills. But let's come back. You know about the march in Washington, August 1963. President Kennedy heard that that march was going to happen, and he didn't like it. So he decided he could try to somehow undermine the march, and he tried to call it off by convening a meeting of civil rights leaders at the White House in June of 1963. And my father was invited to participate in that meeting. My father replied to the invitation by sending President Kennedy a telegram. Some of you may not even know what a telegram is anymore, but some of you remember. This is what it looked like, and here's the text. Remember telegram language? I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow, 4 p.m. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. We forfeit right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogue have failed. They must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare a state of moral emergency. I want to focus on that. Moral emergency. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. I want to place this telegram of June 1963 in its historical context. 5 days before my father sent this telegram, he sent it on June 16th, the meeting at the White House was June 20th. 5 days earlier, June 11th, 1963, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, attempted to block the enrollment of Vivian Malone and James Hood at the University of Alabama. President Kennedy sent a military force to make Governor Wallace step aside. And that evening, President Kennedy addressed the nation on television and radio with a historic speech in which he called upon Congress to pass new civil rights legislation, and he urged the country to embrace civil rights as a moral issue in our lives. And then, that night, a few hours later, the early hours of June 12th, a member of the Ku Klux Klan assassinated Medgar Evers, Field Secretary of the Mississippi NAACP. Now, my father called in his telegram for the president to declare a state of moral emergency. You know what a state of political or national or military emergency, what is a moral emergency? A moral emergency, what is it? What is it for the country? What is it for religious people? What constitutes an emergency in relation to racism? It's a fear that racism had become an acceptable norm in this country, acceptable in legal, social, and political terms. It is an emergency, a moral emergency for our democracy, which claims that all are included, all are equal. How can democracy tolerate its own denial? Why a moral emergency? How can religion exist in a country in which racism is acceptable? Racism is the emergency, You cannot worship God and treat other human beings with the systematic denial of dignity. Moral emergency is the tone of the prophets. Injustice may be uncomfortable for us, but we tolerate it. We hope for things to improve eventually. Whereas for the prophets, injustice is utterly intolerable, blasphemous, a denial of God. How can I pray when atrocities are committed in my name by my government? My father writes, we are not only involved in a major legal and social revolution, we need not fail to realize that we also face a spiritual emergency. If the state sanctions racism, it is God who must intervene. What is racism? It is when a group of people is designated to stand outside the realm of our ethical obligation as human beings. The civil rights movement was the revolution that challenged the absence of that obligation, that ethical obligation, as the very key to America, the very key to religious faith and to the survival of our humanity. What are the many facets of racism? We know. There's implicit bias, there's structural racism. There are problems in individual lives, just getting a job interview. There's a lifespan. But racism is also slippery and hides even among the most righteous of us. It is also tenacious and leaves us wondering why it is so appealing and so difficult to renounce, to extirpate. So what are our Christian and Jewish obligations? In one sense, it should be so obvious. Ours is the Bible that gave the world teachings against racism in the Exodus, in the prophets. Jews and Christians are people who may think of themselves as predominantly white, but think of all the many Christians and Jews who are black and who are subjected to racial injustice, police brutality, unequal income. And we need to make racism central to the agenda of all religious organizations because Black Lives Matter. And we have the power and influence, as well as the wherewithal, we certainly in the Jewish community with our Jewish organizations, to do something about it. It's not about charity, tzedakah. It's essential to our survival. What is a moral emergency? A moral emergency is a suspension of the everyday, of the immorality of racism that passes for normal. A state of emergency, first of all, is disclosure, to see what is happening, to be shocked out of our complacency, and to be forced to confront